thing. That is, we were both making the distinction between a just cause and a just war. That is, there are things that happen in the world that are bad and that you want to do something about. And so you have a just cause there. But our culture is so war-prone that we immediately rush and make this logical jump from, oh, this is a good cause, therefore it deserves a war. No. You have to be very, very careful in making that jump from, oh, this is a good cause, to, oh, therefore we have to make war to do something about it. No. Well, it was actually, you might say it was a good cause to get Spain out of Cuba in 1898. Spain was oppressing Cuba. But did that necessarily mean, therefore, we had to go to war against Spain? You have to examine that war very carefully to see what it produced. You know, you have to see, you have to then understand that we got Spain out of oppressing Cuba and got ourselves in to oppress Cuba. So you have to be very careful. You might say that stopping North Korea from invading South Korea there's a just cause there. They shouldn't do that. It's not good. It's not right. Does that mean, therefore, we should go to war to stop it? Especially if that war, and you know the Korean War is one of the least known wars. It's sort of a war that's been lost in history. 2 to 3 million Koreans died in that war. A cause, a just cause. North Korea should not invade South Korea. So we go, what's the answer? War. What's the result? 2 to 3 million Koreans dead. And is there any particular change in the alignment of South Korea and North Korea? No, it starts off with a dictatorship in South Korea and a dictatorship in North Korea. And it ends up, after 2 million dead, with a dictatorship in South Korea and a dictatorship in North Korea. I have to be very careful about rushing from one thing to another, from just cause to just war. And Erwin Knoll is the only other person I found who was thinking exactly along the same lines. I'm always looking for somebody who's thinking along the same lines as me. That's what I do. I go around looking for people. Very gratified when I find somebody. The American Revolution, independence from England, a just cause. Yeah, why should a group of colonists here be occupied by, yeah, they were occupying us, they were, oppressing us, therefore we go to war, the Revolutionary War. How many people die in the Revolutionary War? Nobody knows exactly. By the way, you'll find out when you look at the statistics of war dead that nobody ever knows exactly how many people die. Who cares? But 25,000 to 50,000 people die. Let's take the lower figure. 25,000 die in the Revolutionary War in a population of 3 million. That would be equivalent today to 2.5 million people dying in a war to get England off our backs. Well, you might consider that worth it, or you might not. Canada is independent of England. Aren't they? I think so. Not a bad society. They have good health care. They have a lot of things we don't have. They didn't fight a bloody Revolutionary War. Why do we assume that you had to fight a bloody Revolutionary War to get rid of England? Do you know that I always start off saying, do you know? Because I figure people don't know this and they'll be gratified that I'm telling them this. That in the year before the first shots were fired, those famous shots, you know, the shot that was heard around the world, you know, Lexington, Concord, April of 1775, the beginning of the Revolutionary War, that the year before that, farmers in western Massachusetts had driven the British government out of most of western Massachusetts without firing a shot. They had assembled by the thousands and thousands around courthouses, around official offices, and they'd just taken over, and they said goodbye to the British officials. It was a nonviolent revolution that took place. But then came Lexington and Concord, and the revolution became violent, and then the revolution was taken over, not by the farmers, taken over by the founding fathers. Farmers were rather poor. The founding fathers were rather rich. The Revolutionary War is not as simple as it first seems, you know. Oh, independence from England, good. Not that simple. Who actually gained from that victory over England? There were people who gained, no question about that. But it's very important to ask, especially if you're considering a war or evaluating a war, who gained what? And differentiate among the different parts of the population about who benefited from a certain policy. That's one thing we're not accustomed to in this country, because we don't think in class terms. We think, oh, we all have the same interest. We all have the same interest, independence from England. We did not have all the same interest. Do you think the Indians cared about independence from England? No. In fact, the Indians were unhappy that we won independence from England, because England had set a line. The Proclamation of 1763 has set a line and said, you can't go westward into Indian territory beyond this line. And they didn't do it because they loved the Indians. They didn't want trouble, right? When Britain was defeated in the Revolutionary War, that line was eliminated. And now the way was open for the colonists to move westward across the continent, which they did for the next 100 years, committing massacres and making sure that they destroyed Indian civilization. So you're going to say, you know, when you look at the American Revolution, hey, there's a factor you have to take into consideration. The Indians, no, didn't benefit. Did blacks benefit from the Revolution? Slavery was there before, slavery was there after. No, and we remained a slave society after the Revolution. Not only that, we wrote slavery into the Constitution. We legitimized it. What about class divisions? Why do we assume, well, aside from blacks and slaves and Indians, what about just ordinary, let's say, white farmers? Did they have the same interest in the Revolution as John Hancock or Gouverneur Morris or Rich or Madison or Jefferson or the slave owners or the bondholders? Not really. It was not all the common people getting together to fight against England. Washington had a very hard time assembling an army. Well, they got an army. They promised people. They took poor guys and promised them land. They browbeat people, and oh yes, and of course they inspired people. Well, let's have the Declaration of Independence. Wow, this is what we're fighting for. It's always good, if you want to get people who go to war, to give them a good document and to have good words in life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Yeah, that's what we're fighting for. Of course, when they write the Constitution, it's not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When they write the Constitution, it's life, liberty, and property. Have you noticed that difference? You should take notice of these little things. There were class divisions. When you assess and evaluate a war, when you assess and evaluate any policy, you have to ask who gets what. And out of this policy, it's not, oh, the same for all of us. Oh, we're going to raise taxes. On whom? On which part of the population? We're going to spend money. On whom? For no. And what about the revolution? Is there a class division there in the benefits of the revolution? And oh, yes. We were a class society from the beginning. American society started off as a society of rich and poor, of people with enormous grants of land and people with no land. And there were riots. There were bread riots in Boston and flour riots. And there were rebellions all over the colonies of poor against rich, of tenants breaking into jails to release people who were imprisoned there for non-payment of debt. There was class conflict. We try to pretend in this country we're all one big happy family. We're not. And so when you look at the American Revolution, you have to look at it in terms of class. Do you know that in the, again, my air of superiority, did you know what I know? Well, I know you know things that I don't know, but I may as well take advantage of what I know to lord it over everybody else. Do you know that there were mutinies in the Revolutionary Army by the privates against the officers? I ask you, do you know? Because when I studied the American Revolution, and I studied American history, and I'm talking about not just in elementary school, I went to graduate school. I want you to know that. I got a PhD in history. Really. Did I ever learn in my whole undergraduate, graduate education, did I ever learn about mutinies in the Revolutionary Army? No. Well, there's a lot I didn't learn. When I got out of school, I began to learn things. That's when you begin to learn, right? You go to the library. There's nothing like a library. And there were mutinies of ordinary soldiers who saw the way the officers were treated. The officers were getting fine clothes and good food and high pay, and the privates were, well, you saw Valley Forge and no shoes and bad clothes, and they weren't getting paid. They mutinied, thousands of them, and not just 5 or 10, thousands of soldiers mutinied. So many, the mutiny in the Pennsylvania line, as it was called, George Washington worried about this. It was too much to handle. He couldn't put this down. So he made compromises with them. But later, when there was a smaller mutiny in the New Jersey line, not with thousands, but maybe with hundreds, Washington said, execute the leaders. And they took out a number of the mutineers, and they were executed by their fellow mutineers by order of the officers. I tell you this just to indicate that the American Revolution was not a simple affair of all of us against all of them, and not everybody thought that they would benefit from the revolution. And sure, it was a benefit to be freed from England, but in proportion to population, 2.5 million people die, right? When considering war, the human cost needs to be measured against what you gain from war. And on both sides of that ledger, problems arise because when you think about the human cost, generally it's an abstraction. Oh, so many people died. It's a number. You give it a number. World War II, 400,000 died. Civil War, 600,000. The World War II 50 million people died in World War II. Yeah. But it becomes, what does that mean in human terms? So the tendency is, on that side of the ledger, if you really want to have an accurate assessment of weighing the cost against the benefits, you have to look at that cost not as an abstraction, not as a statistic, but you have to look at it in terms of every human being who died, and every human being who lost a limb, and every human being who came out blind, and every human being who came out mentally damaged. You have to put all of that together when you are assessing that side of the ledger, the cost of the war, before you ask the question, well, was it worth it? Was it a just war? Was, you know, yeah, you have to get that side of the ledger right. One of the things that, great things that Drew Gilpin Faust did, I don't know if you know about her book, the book she wrote about the Civil War. It's a wonderful book. Great thing about her book is she brings home in very explicit, very human terms what happens to human beings in that war. The Civil War was an ugly, brutal war of amputation after amputation after amputation done out in the field without anesthetics, you know. So you have to have a careful assessment of that. And then on the other side, okay, this is the cost. You have to, now you know the real cost, the real human cost. And on the side of gain, you have to ask the question I asked about the Revolutionary War. Who gained and who didn't? And what were the class divisions? And what did this class gain and what did that class gain? I'm looking to see if this guy is following me. If you see somebody creeping up behind me, let me know. In the Civil War, again, we learn about the Civil War, North versus South, the blue versus the gray, battles, Antietam and Gettysburg. Hey, who in the North, who in the South, what divisions were there? Well, it was a war to free the slaves. But also there was a class element to it in that poor white people were conscripted into a war which didn't have much meaning for them, and where they were being drafted and where the rich could get out of the draft by paying $300. And so there were riots. Probably a lot of you have heard about the draft riots that took place in New York and other cities during the Civil War. Yeah. There was class conflict in the North. There were some people in the North who got rich during the war. There were fortunes made. J.P. Morgan made a fortune during the Civil War. And that's what wars do. They make some people very rich. And the poor go to fight in the war. Okay, I agree. I mustn't ignore the positive side. And I'm going to come back to that about, yeah, emancipation. Freeing the slaves. That's no small matter. That's a big thing on that side of the ledger. But let's say one more thing about class conflict in the Confederacy. There was class conflict in the Confederacy. Most whites were not slave owners. Maybe 1 out of 6 whites was a slave owner. Whites were not slave owners. Whites were poor jokers fighting in this war for what? And dying at a much higher rate than the soldiers of the North. I mean, the Confederate losses were greater proportionately than the losses in the North. And as the mayhem went on, as the bloodshed magnified, their families back home were starving because the plantation owners were growing cotton instead of food. And so the wives and the daughters and the girlfriends and the sisters and they began to riot. They rioted in Georgia and Alabama. They rioted in protest against the fact that their sons and husbands were dying at the front while the plantation owners were getting rich. Huge desertions in the Confederate Army. This class thing had to be examined. But let me come back to the great positive thing that happened out of the Civil War. The emancipation of the slaves. Except that it was not totally an emancipation. Yes, in a certain sense it was, in another sense it wasn't. Now that's important, because if you're going to lose 600,000 dead in the Civil War, which is equivalent proportion of population to 5 million dead today, imagine a war in which we wage on our soil, state against state, in which 5 million people die. Well, maybe it's worth it if you really the result is to free 4 million black people, bring them into freedom. Well, they weren't exactly brought into freedom. They were brought into semi-slavery. They were betrayed by the politicians and the financiers of the North. They were given promises and promises. But sure, they were no longer technically slaves, but they were left without resources. They were really left at the mercy of the same plantation owners who had owned them as slaves, and now they were serfs. Now they were tenant farmers. Now they couldn't move from one place to another. They were hemmed in by all sorts of restrictions, and many of them were put in jail on false charges. They had vagrancy statutes were passed so that employers could pick up blacks off the street and force them to work, kind of slave labor. I say all this just to indicate that, well, that business of, well, it may have been okay for 600,000 people to die because we ended slavery. Not quite. It's possible that slavery could have been ended another way, without 600,000 dead. That's something we don't think of. Just like we don't think of, could we have won independence from England without a bloody war? The thing about bloody wars, the thing about winning something with violence, is that is controlled from the top. It's not a people's war. Neither the Civil War nor the Revolution War, not a people's war. There are people at the top. They're the ones who gain the most, out of this situation. And so you have to ask the question, yes, could slavery have been ended another way? There are other countries in the Western Hemisphere that ended slavery without a bloody civil war. Still have a green light. Because I was wondering if I'd be able to get to World War II. Which I volunteered to be in. Maybe you know that. Maybe you know my whole history. Maybe you know more about me than I do. But yeah, I volunteered for the Air Force in World War II and flew bombing missions over Europe. I did it because it was a good war. It was the right war. It was a just war. It was, well, after I got out of the war, I began to think sometimes, and research and so on, and go back over things and learn about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and I had just finished my missions in Europe and was going to go to the Pacific to continue dropping bombs, and a bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and the war ended soon after, wow, that's great. I welcomed it. Did I really know what happened when that bomb was dropped on Hiroshima? Did I know what happened to those people? Did I have any idea what that meant to those hundreds of thousands of people, of men, women, and children? No, I did not. When I began to think about that, and then began to think about the people under my bombs, whom I hadn't thought about, I never saw them. Flying 30,000 feet, you don't see anybody. just drop bombs. You know, warfare today is a very antiseptic thing. You know, people blithely, they send Predator missiles, even, well, without any pilots at all, right? You know, that's easy. We'll just kill people, and we won't even take any chances of having anybody shut down. 3 months before Nagasaki, we sent planes over Tokyo to firebomb Tokyo, and 100,000 people were killed in one night in the bombing of Tokyo. I mean, later when I visited Japan and I talked to people there, and later when I visited Hiroshima and I met with people who were survivors of Hiroshima, and you should have seen them, well, people without legs and arms and blind and so on. When I began to see what that, you know, meant, that war, the 50 million dead in the war, and, well, when you say, well, we defeated fascism. Did we? Did we, really? That's another thing, you know. So you find that the Revolutionary War, well, not everything turned out well after the Revolutionary War. Not everything turned out really that great after, and certainly not to warrant that many people killed. And what about World War II? 50 million people dead, and, oh, sure, you got rid of Hitler, you got rid of the Japanese military machine, Mussolini, but did you get rid of fascism in the world? Did you get rid of militarism? Did you get rid of racism? Did you get rid of war? We've had war after war after war. What did those 50 million people die for? We have to rethink this question of war and come to the conclusion. I think the guy who's monitoring this has fallen asleep. And believe me, I am not going to wake him. We have to come to the conclusion, as I have, war cannot be accepted, no matter what. No matter what. War, yeah. You know, no matter what the reasons given, the excuse given, liberty, democracy, this, that, you know, no, war is by definition the indiscriminate killing of huge numbers of people for ends which are uncertain. If you think about means and ends, you think about that ethical proposition and apply it to war, the means are horrible, certainly. The end is uncertain. That alone should make you hesitate. And then, of course, people always ask the question, this question has always been asked of me, and so I'm going to preempt your asking it, even in your head. Yeah, but what else were we to do? This is what people ask. What else are we to do about this, about that, about independence from England, about slavery? And, you know. By the way, an interesting thing about slavery, John Brown wanted to free the slaves. This was a year before the Civil War, right? He tries to start, wasn't very good at it, but he tried to start a slave insurrection, hoping that would, you know, it would spread and spread and spread. Maybe they'd end slavery that way. He's executed by the government of the United States and the state of Virginia for using such violence. The next year they start a war which ends up with 600,000 dead, and everybody is celebrating that slavery is ended in that way. Well, yeah, just one point I want to make. This is a question that says, what else would you do? They say, what else? Yeah, but Hitler, you had to do something. Something about Hitler. I agree, you have to do something about all these things. You have to do something about winning independence if you're oppressed. You have to do something about slavery if there's slavery. You have to do something about fascism. You have to do something about all these things. But you don't have to do war. Yeah. You have to, if we have any brains, I don't know if we do, but we are supposed to be smart. We are smart in so many ways. Surely we should be able to understand that in between war and passivity, there are 1,000 possibilities, you see. But it's curious that once a historical event has taken place a certain way, that is, once history has played itself out in a certain way, Hitler invades Czechoslovakia, Poland, we go to war, war lasts a number of years, the war is over. Once it has played out in a certain way, fascism is over. Once it's played out that way, it becomes very hard to imagine that you could have achieved that result some other way. It's because when something has happened in history, it takes on a certain air of inevitability. This is the only way it could have happened. No. And you see so many instances in history where surprising things take place that you wouldn't have imagined. I mean, if the African National Congress had decided on a bloody war of rebellion against the apartheid system, well, that might be justified. End apartheid? Yes. There would be a war. They'd end apartheid. Maybe 1 million people would be killed, mostly black people. And if it happened that way, then you would say, well, I guess it was the only way it could have been done. Apartheid ended. Because the African National Congress decided, no, we don't want that. We're going to do it another way. We're not going to be passive. We're going to fight back in various ways. We're going to have strikes. We're going to have all sorts of things. We're going to have economic pressure. We're going to do all sorts of things to bring down this regime little by little, to erode its power. Yeah, but we're not going to have a bloody war in which we are going to be the victims, mostly. Anyway, finally, you're saved. Say, well, you get my point, right? That's all I have to say. Any particular change in the alignment of South Korea and North Korea? No, it starts off with a dictatorship in South Korea and a dictatorship in North Korea. And it ends up, after 2 million dead, with a dictatorship in South Korea and a dictatorship in North Korea. I'd be very careful about rushing from one thing to another, from just cause to just war. And Erwin Knoll is the only other person I found who was thinking exactly along the same lines. I'm always looking for somebody who's thinking along the same lines as me. That's what I do. I go around looking for people. Therefore, it deserves a war. No. You have to be very, very careful in making that jump from, oh, this is a good cause, to, oh, therefore we have to make war to do something about it. No. Well, it was actually, you might say it was a good cause to get Spain out of Cuba in 1898. Spain was oppressing Cuba. That is, we were both making the distinction between a just cause and a just war. That is, there are things that happen in the world that are bad and that you want to do something about. And so you have a just cause there. But our culture is so war-prone that we immediately rush and make this logical jump from, oh, this is a good cause, but did that necessarily mean, therefore, we have to go to war against Spain? You have to examine that war very carefully to see what it produced. You know, you have to see, and you have to then understand that we got Spain out of oppressing Cuba and got ourselves in to oppress Cuba. So you have to be very careful. You might say that stopping North Korea from invading South Korea there's a just cause there. They shouldn't do that. It's not good. It's not right. Does that mean, therefore, we should go to war to stop it? Especially if that war, and you know the Korean War is one of the least known wars. It's sort of a war that's been lost in history. 2 to 3 million Koreans died in that war. A just cause. North Korea should not invade South Korea. So we go, what's the answer? War. What's the result? 2 to 3 million Koreans dead. And is there